It's easy to fall into the trap of dismissing criticisms of the current economic system as pie in the sky and unworkable, when the overwhelming majority of critics of the current system are pretty clearly demonstrably wrong if you know the first thing about economics. And alternative systems that people have proposed that have been tried have ranged from worse to catastrophically worse. The vast majority of people you see criticizing the current economic system are just sort of complaining about capitalism generally without seeming to understand really what capitalism is, much less the arguments in favor of it, and can't even seem to understand pretty basic concepts like comparative advantage or why rent control will always increase rent prices in the long term. And then you have the exceptions. So you have smart people like James Lovelock, author of Gaia, or Donella Meadows, author of Thinking Systems. She's also one of the co-authors of The Limits to Growth, Club of Rome. She was part of that, but I have that book, and I used it in another video, and now I can't find what I did with it. But anyways, these are smart people, but when they make specific predictions, they always turn out not only to be wrong, but generally things go in the opposite direction of what they are predicting. Although, as I've said, things keep going the way they have until they don't, and we have reasons to think that this can't go on forever. And so the Austrian economists have been the people who, at least like narrowly, when you're thinking about how markets function, have been the people who seem to have the best understanding of how economies work, at least like of the systems I know of. And that's despite the fact that quite a lot of people who quote Austrian economists don't understand them and make them sound incredibly stupid. Though I've realized there's sort of a Sturgeon's law to ideas. Any idea that has even any like popularity is going to sound stupid talking to most people about it because most people don't really understand it. And conversely, even if an idea is not that way, if you're used to hearing stuff that's dumb but sounds similar, it's easy to mistake what people are saying at least the first couple times you hear it. And so with all that in mind, like you may have seen from some videos, I've identified in some way as a libertarian for pretty much all my adult life. First, I was basically a neoliberal. Then I was what you might call a woke capitalist. Then I was sort of going more towards classical liberalism, although I did not want to use the term because classical liberals tend to be cringe. So I would say things like I'm a pragmatic anarchist or anarcho-pragmatist, or just say I'm kind of libertarian-ish. But increasingly, like I'm realizing the context things, the issues around the current economic system that we have, that I recognized as a kid and then sort of explained away because the people who understood economics most narrowly were sort of explaining it away. And again, the anti-capitalist critics tend to just be completely sort of aggressively ignorant, while the smarter hard green critics have been demonstrably wrong so far. It was easy to think, okay, it must be that the infinite growth people are correct. And yet, as I talked about in my video on infinite growth, that relied on a lot of assumptions that don't seem to be borne out. And so with that all in mind, I ran across Kate Raworth's channel promoting this book, Donut Economics, a few months ago. And so she has like a little rap battle-y music video, which I thought was kind of straw-manning what economists actually believe. And I realized, no, it's not. It's accurately representing what sort of mainstream economists believe. And I was giving them too much credit because I was looking for the best arguments, which I think come from the Austrian economists. In sort of, the Austrian economists don't fully defend the current system, but they defend a lot of these elements of the current model, which Raworth and which people like Lovelock or Meadows would criticize. And so I thought the video was kind of strawmanny at the time, but I also found it charming. And then I watched her short explainers of the idea of donut economics. And I was looking at it, and in the short form, it looked like, again, it looked sort of like implausible pie-in-the-sky thinking. But it also, I could tell it was different from other things I'd seen, and I thought there was something there. And I really didn't know what to expect. And so, because I discovered her on YouTube, I sort of thought of this as a YouTuber book, even though really she's a professional development economist who happens to have a small YouTube channel, which is actually even smaller than mine. But anyways, so I finally got around to reading this book, and I forget exactly what prompted, but I was like, oh, I feel like I should read this now. And I did a short on it because I had to keep putting this book down, because I like reading books that have enough of a frame of reference I can agree and get what they're saying, And then they're also saying things that I disagree with, and they challenge me, and they also teach me new things, which this book does. But it was giving me whiplash sort of between I'm in complete agreement and wait, did you not think of this basic thing? And some of these things on finishing the book, I think she did, but she's thinking about the world in a different way. Some of them I'm still kind of wondering. Oh, and then she was also giving me like a bunch of new information that I had to digest. So I kept, fortunately, this chapter has like sections within the chapter, because I was frequently putting it down after a couple sections, not even finishing a chapter. So it took me, short book, took me like 4 or 5 days to finish this book, just because I had to keep putting it down to process and think about what she was saying. And I've realized, I think she really has 2 main points in this book that she keeps repeating across this book, and I'm fully in agreement with both of them. And I do question a lot of her ancillary ideas. But so I made a video like a month or 2 ago about, I think it's 11 books that turn my worldview upside down. And I said my criteria was it has to do 3 things. So there are books that will shake loose something that I didn't realize I was assuming until this book shows me I was assuming it and I don't have a good reason for assuming it and I question it. Or it crystallizes and clarifies something I was grasping at. Or it gives me like new frameworks and ways of thinking about the world. And Donut Economics absolutely would have made that list if I had read this book before making that video, because it does all 3 of those things. And when it comes to crystallizing things, I think her 2 central points in this book are crystallizing sort of 2 things that I was grasping at. And so one of them is the power of using new diagrams and simple diagrams and illustrations to explain things to people. And that one I realized, I think I kind of haven't been doing that a lot. It's not like I haven't thought of it, but it's that the people I see doing that on YouTube are pretty much all like right-wing channels making generally kind of similar content, that this is why the world sucks and it's because liberals are ruining the world, basically. And so I think sort of I was implicitly thinking, well, I'm not making that kind of content, so I'm not going to try to explain my thinking with simplistic drawings and illustrations. But of course, Kate Raworth is someone who is a lot like me. Like I've described my thinking as being upside down and outside in compared to most people, and she is very much someone I think thinks like that from how I'm reading this book. And I would actually, reading this book, I'm realizing I think I still need to process it, but I would love to see if I can interview her. And that's got me thinking about maybe I should start doing interviews on this channel in general. And I have a couple other people I might do too if I do that, but I need to figure that out. But anyways, so that was one thing, was I realized, and I'll talk about that more, like drawing, illustrating ideas, because I actually want to talk about this chart, which I will probably have a short out yesterday, and if not, it'll be out tomorrow. But I want to talk about that at the end, because I want to get to the other big thing, sort of about economics. Her point, which is basically, she calls GDP, it's a cuckoo in the nest. And so I've known about the issues with GDP for a while. And one of the best illustrations is, so let's say that I have this book and I say, okay, I will sell you this book for $1,000. And then you sell it back to me for $1,000. And we do this 1,000 times. Well, now we have just created $1 million in GDP, but we've created no new value, assuming I end up back where I started with the book, right? And obviously that's an extreme example, but that is sort of the logic of GDP that has been raised a lot. So for example, economists don't count women's contributions in the home as GDP, which has been, there have been a number of factors that have pushed women into the workplace, but one of them has been women are not contributing to GDP unless you're contributing in the economy, and consequently women's contributions in the home have been undervalued. But the other thing that I'm thinking about, I'm realizing, is GDP is a quantitative measure. So there's the criticism of just, it's not measuring all value, it's not measuring what you're producing yourself, what you're producing for friends and family, right? Which is a lot of like the most value we have, but it's also quantitative. It's the streetlight fallacy and the quantification fallacy. I've talked about the streetlight fallacy is you're looking for stuff under the streetlight as opposed to where you'd actually find it. And the quantification fallacy is you only take seriously things that have numbers behind them. And a lot of value is fundamentally qualitative, which is something I've sort of been thinking about. And that has been, I'm going to have a whole video on this distinction. I talked about it a little bit, but only narrowly in terms of like scientific research and ways of knowing. But so I've mentioned, and a subscriber recommended this book to me, We've Never Been Woke by Musa Al-Harbi. I've talked about it a few times. And he talks about this idea of symbolic capitalism. And I realized basically I come from the class of people who is generally symbolic capitalists. I did sort of symbolic capitalist jobs. I ruled out doing the truly creative jobs because those are mostly rewarded with status as opposed to money, and I didn't really care a lot about status. Now I care about it more as an instrumental currency, but still not as an end to itself. And before I didn't really care about it at all. So even though I'm a creative person, I ruled out making a living at it. And I've realized with these jobs, so I've talked about The Logic of Liberty by Michael Polanyi a lot of times, and people would always tell me, like, you should go into academia. And I would look at them and I'd be like, why would I want to spend a quarter of my time writing grant proposals, a quarter of my time sitting on committees, a quarter of my time doing research I don't actually care about to get published in order to keep my job, and a quarter of time teaching to people who mostly don't want to be there but are forced to be there as a distribution requirement or a requirement for a major that they're doing in order to get work. Like, why would I want to do that? But it's people have this view of academia as being a place where people who are curious and intellectually gifted can explore ideas and learn things which gradually will contribute to the general body of human knowledge. And I thought that was just like a myth that never existed. And then reading Polanyi, I realized, oh, it did. But even by the time he was writing, we were starting to replace that. And he predicted like some of the things we did would replace that system with something that is a lot less scientific, but a lot more quantifiable, a lot more legible. And that's happened in other creative professions too. And so like growing up, I understood, because people would harp on the idea, the value of your idea isn't in your ideas, it's your execution, which is true, but it also smuggles in the way that these people are using it is you should be executing this according to very specific metrics, with the ultimate results being measured in terms of how many book sales you get. And then, of course, that's even if you can get published, because a lot of books that could sell well don't get published. And so I conflated those two things because the people teaching me these kind of things are the symbolic capitalists, the kind of symbolic capitalists who can reasonably be referred to as midwits. And a lot of these creative professions, because they've had some degree of status, the midwits have sort of forced their way in and then changed the rules to basically be built around gatekeeping them for midwits. And so I've spent all my life sort of trying to be less original and more fitting into a midwit template. And as I mentioned in my video, AI Slop Set Me Free, the fact that basically AI slop can do what those kind of creative professionals do well enough that it fools most of their audience and it's putting them out of business helped me finally realize there is actual value in my kind of creativity. And that's sort of what I'm trying to pursue more. And I'm going to probably have a blog post up, unless I change my mind. I'll have that up by the night before this video comes out. And I've been thinking about this too, again, quality versus quantity, right? So I mentioned John Gray in The Two Faces of Liberalism says basically philosophical liberalism was defined by its belief in individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, and meliorism, the belief in your ability to like work to improve the world. And I've added rationalism to that. And then I say, of those ideas, by 2023, I had given up on universalism, rationalism, and meliorism, but I had clung tenaciously to my understanding of egalitarianism and individualism as I had sort of been taught. And I'm going to have to make videos sort of explaining, because there are older conceptions that might work, and we've again sort of smuggled in conceptions of those that don't work. And so reading this book, he was sort of trying to debunk the modern conception of egalitarianism, but also accidentally broke my faith in the modern conception of individualism as we practiced it as well, and I'm working through that. And so the other thing about Musa al-Harbi, when everyone broke symbolic capitalists, is I realized like I don't have the same values and the same goals as they do, because we're very different people, because basically the symbolic capitalists are pretending to be what I am, telling me I need to be more like them to be what I actually am. And I've sort of broken that cycle by, oh, they're pretending to be what I am. I can just be what I am. And that is ultimately going to benefit me, though it's going to take some time to figure out how to make that work. And so then I read these two books, Revolt of the Masses by Jose Ortega y Gasset and The Windmills of Sancho Panza. And that sort of clarified for me. And I realized basically midwits are what Ortega y Gasset calls mass man, who fundamentally, they're only sort of interested in the short term, and they're interested in what they can get out of stuff. And that, as they've gotten into power, they've sort of refined all of our metrics for success around that, which is quantitative because it is what they can understand, and it serves their own interests, and it's quantitative in the short term too. And so I'm going to have more to say about like GDP in general, but basically reading Donut Economics and realizing, oh, like GDP is, yeah, it's actually a really dumb measure for economics, and we should be doing away with it. And it's a good example of Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. And there are people who make arguments against that, but those arguments depend on people actually good faith, trying to live up to the spirit of it, which in sort of a managerialized culture designed around midwits, it absolutely does not. And the other thing that I've realized, like creatively, is so I really want to talk about this book, After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre, and I keep having stuff come up, but I'm going to mention basically his argument is that historically, everyone understood virtue in the same way, like on a high level. They had different sort of low-level conceptions, but it was about doing well within a system of practice, basically. And then we sort of, with the Enlightenment and with the Enlightenment progressing, because early Enlightenment thinkers still had this idea, but later Enlightenment thinkers basically redefined virtue to be utilitarianism, because utilitarianism is theoretically quantifiable, even if it really isn't. And it's sort of almost an anti-system, an anti-virtue, although you'll see utilitarians who love to argue all ethics reduces to utilitarianism. I think Ursula Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Amalas, is one of the best critiques of utilitarianism, although I've seen people argue that people who read it that way are missing the point. I think it can do multiple things at once. But anyways, and then you also see he talks about this isn't the first time you've kind of had a shift to what he calls, I think it's thin ethics or something like that, which is utilitarianism. And the last time you had that was when you saw the original Stoicism come about. And Stoicism is basically, life is hard, so there's virtue is in pushing through life because it's hard, which is, I know that's sort of an oversimplification of Stoicism, but it is also kind of the central element, I think, as I would agree with MacIntyre. It's the thing that I dislike about Stoicism as a philosophy. And he says that, and now when you have utilitarianism like becoming the dominant idea, Stoicism is making a comeback because it is sort of a halfway point between a practice, which is about doing well in a way that sort of motivates you, gives you a reason for living, versus like the thin ethics of utilitarianism. And so anyway, so there's like a lot more here that I want to get into and with this book. But I've been thinking about this because, as I said, so I made this chart. So I've talked about this with like people I know. I think I first talked about it on the channel in my Ursula Le Guin video. And then I illustrated it. And I illustrated it sort of based on partially, so this book, The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott, which is, so basically he argues the societies of mainland Southeast Asia were organized like vertical, like topographically, as much as like laterally reaching out. So you had the state centered in the river valleys of like the main river valleys. And then you had like smaller tributary states in like the smaller tributary river valleys. And then you had people who were completely ungoverned up in the hill country. And you had this sort of vertical relationship of trade and migration and occasionally conquest. And so I was sort of thinking about this book when I did this illustration. And I was also thinking about, because I had just read Donut Economics, and I was also doing an interview with P.F. Jung, which I did a post announcing it, but YouTube, because I was doing a bunch of posts like sharing videos that I thought would be interesting to my viewers, and apparently YouTube really hates that, and so they've shadow banned me from even like using the video link sharing thing. So you can check that out in my homepage, my collaborations, that I might put in my description too, and I have like an interviews playlist. But anyways, P.F. Jung has this idea of the meme adoption curve, and I've been talking about how cybernetics is basically like all of the life sciences and social sciences are the study of cybernetics, which is basically the sort of study of complex interrelated feedback processes in what Warren Weaver called problems of ordered complexity, which I talked about again in my social science video. And so like I'm realizing, okay, I'm sort of presenting this as a static thing because I'm like, okay, so to explain this chart, so you have outsiders, people who may or may not be quality, but they're generally truly original and weird. And then you have, on the other hand, you have the valley of the mainstream. This would be your Stephen King, your J.K. Rowling. A lot of these people end up forgotten. Some of them, like Agatha Christie and Shakespeare, we keep reading. And then in between the outsiders and the valley of the mainstream, you have people who are increasingly obscure, but who sort of, I would say, maximize quality. And they'd all be like X is X, creatives, creative, writers, writer, artist, artist, that kind of thing, right? But you have the near highbrow of what people who are down in the valley of the mainstream would actually read. And then you have the far highbrow of people in the valley of the mainstream they reference, but they don't read. And then up in the clouds, you have strictly X is X, people down here won't even have heard of, although people in sort of near and far highbrow and strictly X is X will have heard of. And my concern has been that I'm sort of naturally here. And my question was, well, can I get to here? And I still have something I'm going to try to do that. But I'm also realizing, like, my concern about that is mostly, I felt like to have a chance of making money to do anything creative, I would need to get down to like near highbrow, and that still might be the case. But that might not necessarily be the case, especially with AI sort of. I've realized most people like down in the valley of the mainstream they cannot tell AI slop from like actual quality stuff that sort of people who are good at doing like high production quality but bad at originality do. And it's putting at least new creators out of work and putting more value on my kind of creativity. So I'm embracing that now, and we'll see how this goes. But yeah, I wanted to talk about sort of a lot of stuff. I know this is going to sound scattered. To me, it all hangs together. So hopefully people appreciate this, at least people who watch my channel. Sorry if you don't. And I will be explaining this in a more accessible way, I think, in future videos, as well as, again, I'm going to get way more into donut economics, because this right now, I'm just sort of thinking about GDP as a quantification thing, and I'm realizing quantification in general is kind of a cuckoo, like in the nest of what is actual value in our lives and what is virtue, as McIntyre would put it. But anyways, yeah, so I wanted to talk about all that. If you want to support me, I have Amazon affiliate links and Ko-Fi in the description, also a consulting page. And thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.